Welcome to our deep dive all about psychology. You've given us a really interesting mix here.
Yeah.
It's like excerpts from a psychology textbook
Yeah.
and even some glossary entries and,
A glossary.
yeah, glossary, and even some research studies.
Wow.
So we're going to kind of explore all of that and see how psychology evolved, how it investigates the mind, and uncover some of those key concepts that kind of influence how we think and feel and act.
I like to think of it as like assembling this toolkit,
Uh,
to help us understand ourselves better.
Oh, a mental toolkit. I like that.
Yeah, a mental toolkit.
Yeah, so let's get started. What exactly is psychology?
Well, psychology is the scientific study of the mind, brain, and behavior. It basically seeks to understand, why we do the things we do, how our brains work, and how our experiences kind of shape who we are. It's actually really fascinating to consider that even ancient philosophers like Confucius, they grappled with these really big questions about things like learning and memory and consciousness that are still very relevant to psychology today.
It is so interesting to think about how those big questions have been around for centuries.
I know.
So where did the formal study of psychology actually begin? Like when did it become, an actual thing?
Well, a lot of people say that 1879 was the birth year of psychology
Oh,
because that's when Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, he established the first experimental psychology lab.
okay.
And that really marked a shift towards using a scientific approach to understand the mind.
So I guess things really took off from there
Yeah.
because our sources mention all of these different schools of thought emerging, like structuralism and functionalism. There's just so much to unpack.
There is. Each of these schools, they really offered their own unique perspective on how to study the mind. So think about structuralism, for example. It was kind of like trying to understand a house by analyzing its individual bricks and beams.
Oh,
But
interesting.
they really relied on introspection, which is basically just asking people to describe their thoughts and feelings. And as you can imagine,
Yep.
that proved to be, well, not super reliable.
Yeah, unreliable.
Because people's experiences are just so subjective, right?
Yeah, it's almost like trying to measure happiness with a ruler, right?
Yeah.
You can't quantify that. So what came next?
Well,
Did another school of thought kind of try to put all of those pieces back together, so to speak?
you could definitely say that. Functionalism emerged.
Okay.
And they focused on the purpose of the mind and really how those mental processes help us adapt to our environment. So they drew a lot of inspiration from Darwin's theory of evolution.
Oh, okay.
And they argued that mental processes evolved over time because they helped our ancestors survive.
So even our thoughts and feelings have been shaped by survival of the fittest.
Exactly.
That's a really cool way to look at it.
Yeah.
Now, our sources also mention psychoanalytic theory,
Mhm.
and I have to admit, when I hear that, I immediately think of Sigmund Freud.
Right.
What was his big contribution?
Well, Freud, he kind of dove deep right into the unconscious mind. He argued that hidden beneath the surface of our awareness are all of these desires and motivations and conflicts that are really shaping us. And he also believed that early childhood experiences have a really big influence in forming our personalities.
So according to Freud, we're all kind of walking around with this hidden world inside of us.
Yeah.
Kind of spooky.
Yeah, it is kind of spooky.
But then it seems like behaviorism really swung the pendulum in the complete opposite direction.
It did, yeah.
Yeah.
So behaviorists like John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner,
Mhm.
they weren't really interested in those internal states. They said that psychology should just focus on observable behaviors
Oh, yeah.
and how those are shaped by the environment. Think of it like this. They really believe that everything we do is the result of learning through associations. So if you do something and you get rewarded, you're probably going to do it again. And if you do something and get punished, you're probably less likely to do it again.
Right. That makes sense. But
Right.
it almost sounds like training a pet. Did they actually work with animals a lot?
They did use animal models in their research, but those principles, those learning principles,
Right.
have been applied to human behavior as well.
Yeah.
Particularly in things like education and therapy.
Okay, so from the mysterious unconscious mind to like a totally observable world,
Right.
psychology has gone through some twists and turns.
For sure.
What about humanism?
Okay.
It sounds more uplifting.
It does. Humanism emerged kind of in the mid-20th century as a response to both psychoanalysis, AD, behaviorism.
Okay.
So they emphasized free will and self-actualization and the positive aspects of human nature. Think of figures like Carl Rogers, for example, who believed that we all strive for personal growth and that therapy should really help people reach their full potential.
It's definitely refreshing to hear about a perspective that focuses on our potential rather than just our problems, right?
Definitely.
What about cognitivism?
Okay.
Where does that fit in?
Cognitivism really challenged behaviorism's dominance. It kind of marked a return to the study of those mental processes, like thinking and memory and language. Cognitive psychologists, they argued that you can't really understand behavior without understanding how people process information. They even compare the mind to a computer, seeing it as this information processor.
So if behaviorism is like the hardware of the mind,
Yes.
cognitivism is like the software.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, so it seems like psychology just keeps encompassing more and evolving,
It does.
which leads us to modern psychology.
Right?
What are some of the biggest developments in modern psychology that have changed how we understand the mind?
One of the biggest has been advances in neuroscience, especially brain imaging techniques like fMRI,
Oh, yeah.
which have really been revolutionary. We can now see which parts of the brain light up when someone's doing a task
Right.
or feeling a certain emotion. So we're getting these incredible insights into how the brain actually works.
It's like having a window into the brain.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, our sources also mention the human genome.
Mm-hmm.
How has that research changed things?
Well, mapping the human genome has opened up all these new avenues for understanding how genes influence our behavior
Okay.
and how they might predispose us to certain traits or even disorders.
Yeah.
But it's complicated.
Sure.
Genes don't work in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
They interact with our environment in all these really intricate ways.
So it really is nature and denurture working together.
Yes.
It seems like there's always something new to discover in psychology.
Definitely.
But I have to ask, how does all of this apply to our real lives? I mean, besides therapy, where else do we see psychology at work?
Oh, gosh. Psychology is everywhere. It's really relevant to basically any career you can think of. Businesses use psychology to understand consumer behavior and marketing.
Oh, right.
Educators use it to design more effective teaching methods. Even something like writing a novel can really benefit from an understanding of psychology, creating those characters, personalities, evoking emotions that all draws on those principles that we've been talking about.
You're right. Psychology can help us to understand ourselves
Right.
and each other.
Yeah.
And that's really essential no matter what we do in life.
For sure. And that understanding is really built on solid research.
Right.
So why don't we dive into the heart of scientific psychology,
Yes.
which is research methods.
Yes. Let's get to the experiments.
All right.
How do psychologists actually do research?
Well, it all starts with something called the scientific method, which is basically just a systematic way of asking and answering questions about the world.
Okay.
So the first step is coming up with the theory, which is a broad explanation based on existing knowledge.
So a theory is kind of like a big picture framework for understanding something.
That's right.
Okay. So what happens next?
Well, from that theory, you would create a hypothesis, which is basically a testable prediction about what you expect to observe.
So the theory is kind of the big idea, and the hypothesis is the testable prediction.
You got it.
Okay. What happens next?
Well, now you have to design a study to actually test that hypothesis.
Okay.
And psychologists, they've got lots of different tools in their research toolkit.
Huh.
Each research method has its strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so what are the main types of research methods in psychology?
Well, they generally fall into three categories: descriptive, correlational, and experimental.
Okay, let's start with descriptive studies.
Okay.
What's the goal there?
With descriptive studies, the aim is really to observe and describe behavior without manipulating anything. So it's kind of like taking a snapshot of a particular phenomenon.
Oh, okay. So I can see how observing people, in their natural setting would be, helpful for research. But what about those self-reports? Aren't people's answers sometimes influenced by, what they think they should say, not necessarily what they actually feel?
You're totally right. Self-reports, which are things like surveys, they rely on people's own descriptions of their thoughts and feelings and behaviors.
Right.
And while they're great for collecting a lot of data really quickly,
Yeah.
they're also prone to biases like social desirability, which is basically people just wanting to present themselves in a positive light.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so descriptive studies are about observing and describing.
Yeah.
What about correlational studies?
Okay.
What makes them different?
So correlational studies, they examine how variables are naturally related in the real world, but the researchers aren't actually trying to change anything.
So they're basically seeing if two things kind of go together.
Exactly. Imagine researchers wanted to know if there's a link between, like, exercise and stress levels, right? They might survey a group of people about their exercise habits, their stress levels, and then look for patterns in that data.
Oh, okay. And what would those patterns tell us?
Well, there's a statistical measure called a correlation coefficient,
Oh.
and that tells us both the strength and the direction of the relationship.
Uh,
It can range from perfectly negative to perfectly positive.
hmm.
So a positive correlation means, though, as one variable goes up, the other tends to go up as well. So maybe more exercise is associated with lower stress levels, for example.
Right. I always have to remind myself, correlation does not equal causation.
That is so important to remember.
Yes.
Just because two variables are correlated doesn't mean that one causes the other, right?
Right.
There might be another factor, like a third variable, that's actually influencing both.
Ah, the classic third variable problem.
Right.
You have an example?
Yeah. Imagine a study finds a link between texting while driving and dangerous driving, right?
Okay.
It might seem logical to assume that texting is causing the dangerous driving, but there might be a third variable at play, like maybe a risk-taking personality.
Oh, right.
People with that personality trait, they might be more likely to both text while driving and engage in other risky driving behaviors.
So the correlation might be there, but it's not the whole story.
Exactly.
And that's why experiments are so important, right?
That's right. Experimental studies are really the gold standard for figuring out cause and effect because researchers can actually manipulate one variable to
Okay.
see how it affects another.
So let's break down how those experiments work.
Okay.
What is an independent variable?
The independent variable, or IAGI, is basically what the experimenter manipulates or changes in a study.
It's what the researchers are controlling.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about the dependent variable?
The dependent variable, or DV, is what's measured to see if it's affected by the independent variable. It's called dependent because
Okay.
it depends on the independent variable.
Got it. Could you give us an example to
Yeah.
illustrate those terms?
Yeah, sure. Let's stick with the driving theme, right?
Yeah.
So if we're studying the effects of cell phone use on driving, our IV could be the type of cell phone use. So like talking, texting, or no phone at all. And then our DV would be a measure of driving performance,
Okay.
like reaction time or the number of errors a driver makes.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about that control group?
Okay.
Why is it so important to have one of those in an experiment?
The control group is basically acting as our baseline. They're treated exactly the same way as the experimental group,
Okay.
but they don't receive the manipulation of the independent variable.
So in that cell phone and driving experiment, the control group will be the drivers who aren't using their phones at all.
That's right. And then we can compare their driving to the groups who are using their phones in different ways.
Yep.
And that helps us to really isolate the effects of cell phone use and rule out other explanations for why we might see differences in their driving performance.
So it's basically making sure that you're only measuring what you intend to measure
Yes.
and not just some other random factor.
Exactly. That's actually a very important point because internal validity, which is basically being confident that the changes you see are really caused by your manipulation,
Right.
is so essential for any good experiment.
So without good internal validity, you can't really trust the results of an experiment.
That's right.
Okay. Do you have another example that illustrates how important those control groups are?
Yeah, think about a study looking at whether a new tutoring program improves students' exam grades.
Okay.
If you just compare the grades of the students who got tutoring to those who didn't, it might look like the tutoring really helped.
Yeah.
But without that control group, how can we be sure that the improvement is due to the tutoring itself and not something else? Like maybe the tutored students were just more motivated to begin with, or they had more support from their families.
Right, right. The
Yeah.
control group kind of helps rule out those other possibilities.
Yes.
Yeah. Now that we've laid the groundwork with research methods,
Okay.
let's zoom in on some of the core components of the human mind,
All right.
starting with the nervous system,
Oh.
which is that complex network that lets us think and feel and act.
Right. Think about it as your body's superhighway,
Okay.
constantly buzzing with information.
All right, so let's get microscopic. What are those building blocks? What's making up that superhighway?
Well, it's made up of these specialized cells called neurons, and those neurons transmit information throughout your entire body.
Oh, yeah. I vaguely remember learning about neurons in school.
Yeah.
Can we get a little refresher on how they work?
Of course. So each neuron has these three main parts: the
Yeah.
dendrites, the cell body, and the axon.
Okay.
So the dendrites receive signals from other neurons.
Okay.
The cell body keeps the neuron alive and functioning,
Uh-huh.
and then the axon transmits those signals away from the cell body to other neurons, muscles, or glands.
So it's like a tiny communication relay.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about the myelin sheath? What's its role in all of this?
Okay, so the myelin sheath is this fatty substance that covers a lot of axons,
Good.
and it acts kind of like insulation on an electrical wire.
Oh. And it helps speed up those transmissions along the axon.
So it's like the express lane for neural messages.
Yeah,
So what
exactly.
happens when that signal reaches the end of the axon?
Well, that's where we have the synapse,
Okay.
which is basically this tiny gap between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another.
So the signal has to kind of jump across that gap.
It does. And when a signal reaches that axon terminal, it triggers the release of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters into the synapse.
Oh, yes, neurotransmitters. Those are the famous brain chemicals, right?
Nice.
What do they actually do?
So think of neurotransmitters as keys that fit into specific locks, right?
Okay.
And those locks are the receptor sites on the receiving neuron.
Mm-hmm.
And when a neurotransmitter binds to a receptor site,
Yeah.
it can either excite the receiving neuron, making it fire, or it can actually inhibit it, which prevents firing.
So it's like a complex dance of these chemical signals.
It is.
Speaking of those signals, our sources actually mention several really key neurotransmitters. Yeah.
Can you give us a rundown of some of the big players?
Let's start with acetylcholine, which is involved in muscle movement, learning, and memory. And then there's norepinephrine, which plays a role in arousal and attention and mood.
Okay, so acetylcholine for movement, norepinephrine for arousal.
Right.
Okay. What about serotonin? I feel like I've heard that one a lot.
Yeah, serotonin, it helps regulate mood, sleep, and appetite.
Okay, so serotonin for mood and sleep
Mm-hmm.
and appetite. What about dopamine?
Dopamine is all about pleasure and reward.
Okay.
So it plays a big role in things like motivation and addiction. Dopamine is released when we experience something pleasurable, and that makes us want to do it again and again.
Right, that makes sense.
Mhm.
We still have a few more on our list.
Okay.
What about GABA?
GABA is like your brain's braking system, so to speak. It's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it helps to calm neural activity and reduce anxiety.
Okay, so GABA kind of chills things out, while glutamate.
Glutamate does the opposite. It revs things up. It's excitatory, involved in learning and memory.
Okay, so GABA chills things out, glutamate revs things up.
Mm-hmm.
What about endorphins? Endorphins are our body's natural painkillers, right?
They are. They're released in response to pain or stress, and they create those feelings of euphoria and well-being. Endorphins are incredibly powerful, and in fact, morphine, which is a potent painkiller,
Right.
actually works by binding to the same receptors in the brain as endorphins.
So our bodies can create their own painkillers.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that this also has a darker side.
It does, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That potent pain relief and mood boost are really what's fueled the opioid epidemic, right? So opiate drugs,
Well, right.
they flood the brain with these artificial endorphins, and that leads to tolerance and dependence.
Wow.
And so it's really a reminder that these brain chemicals are so powerful and they can be both beneficial and really harmful.
That's a powerful point.
Yeah.
It's all about balance, right? I remember our sources mentioning something about how neurotransmitters get kind of cleared from the synapse.
They do.
Can you explain that?
Absolutely. So after a neurotransmitter has kind of done its job, it's either broken down by enzymes or it's taken back up into the sending neuron.
Okay.
And that's a process called reuptake.
Oh, okay.
And this cleanup process is really essential to make sure that the signal is terminated and it doesn't continue stimulating the receiving neuron.
So it's like hitting the off switch.
Right.
Now, our sources also mention these terms, agonists and antagonists.
Okay.
What are those, and how do they fit into this whole neurotransmitter picture?
So agonists are substances that enhance the actions of neurotransmitters.
Okay.
So they might increase production or release of neurotransmitters, or they might actually mimic their effects by binding to receptors.
So agonists boost the signal.
They do.
Okay. And antagonists?
They do the opposite. They block or reduce the effects of neurotransmitters, so they might prevent their release, or they might block them from binding to receptors.
It sounds like a constant tug-of-war in the brain.
Right.
Can you give us an example of how agonists and antagonists play out in the real world?
Sure. Let's use eating as an example.
Okay.
So when you eat something delicious, your brain releases dopamine, right? That pleasure and reward signal.
Right.
So imagine an agonist drug
Okay.
that boosts that dopamine signal, making the food even more rewarding and potentially leading to overeating.
Okay.
And then, on the other hand, you can have an antagonist that could block those dopamine receptors, reducing the pleasurable effects of food,
Wow.
and maybe even leading to decreased appetite.
Wow, these drugs can really manipulate our brain chemistry. I find it fascinating, but it's also kind of scary.
It is.
Speaking of which, our sources highlighted this fascinating tidbit about endorphins in pain.
Yeah.
Can you share that?
So endorphins have these incredible pain-reducing effects. And that's actually how morphine works as a painkiller. It binds to those same receptor sites as endorphins, and it's essentially mimicking their effects. So this discovery was huge because it really helped us understand our own body's natural defense system against pain.
That is so remarkable.
It is.
So our bodies create their own pain relief. Now that we've explored the, microscopic world of those neurons and neurotransmitters, let's zoom out a bit. Can we take a tour of some key brain regions and their functions?
Let's start with the brainstem, which is the most basic part of our brain, and it's an extension of the spinal cord.
Okay.
And it's responsible for really essential functions like breathing and heart rate and those sleep-wake cycles.
So the brainstem keeps us alive and kicking.
It does.
What about the cerebellum?
The cerebellum sits at the back of the brain, and it's super important for coordinated movement and balance. So it helps us walk and talk and perform all those smooth actions.
And that's why damage to the cerebellum can lead to all kinds of problems with coordination. Yeah. Okay, what about the hypothalamus?
Okay, so the hypothalamus, it's this tiny structure, but it has a big job.
All right.
It regulates a wide range of bodily functions like hunger and thirst, body temperature, sleep-wake cycles. It also plays a key role in the endocrine system, which releases hormones that influence everything from growth to our mood.
So the hypothalamus is basically the control center for our inner world.
Yeah.
What about the thalamus?
The thalamus acts as a sensory relay station.
Oh.
So it receives information from all of our senses except for smell, which takes a different route to the brain. And then it directs that sensory input to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex for processing.
There's like the brain's operator kind of directing those calls to the right department.
Exactly.
Next up, the hippocampus. Isn't that the memory center?
It is. It's vital for forming new memories, particularly long-term memories of facts and events.
Okay.
And damage to the hippocampus can lead to amnesia, which is basically the inability to form new memories.
I've seen that in movies. It's so scary to think about losing your memories. Okay, what about the amygdala? I always think of the amygdala as like the brain's alarm system.
That's a great analogy. The amygdala is this small almond-shaped structure,
Okay.
and it plays a key role in emotional processing, particularly fear and aggression. So it helps us detect threats, sometimes even before we're consciously aware of them.
So it's like our built-in bodyguard, keeping us safe.
I like that, yeah.
All right. We still got one more major brain region to cover. Right?
Yeah, the cerebral cortex.
Okay.
It's the outermost layer of the brain, and it's really what makes us uniquely human.
Okay.
It's responsible for all of our most complex cognitive functions, so thinking, planning, language, decision-making. And it's divided into 4 lobes,
Okay.
each with its own specialties. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe.
So tell us about those lobes. What makes each one special?
Well, think of the frontal lobe as the brain's CEO. It's in charge of planning, decision-making, impulse control, working memory, and it even plays a role in our personality and social behavior.
Wow, that is a lot of responsibility. What about the parietal lobe?
The parietal lobe processes sensory information from touch, temperature, pain, and pressure. It also helps us understand spatial relationships and where our body is in space.
So the frontal lobe is the boss, and the parietal lobe helps us make sense of the physical world.
Yes.
What about the temporal and occipital lobes? What are their roles?
Okay, so the temporal lobe is essential for processing auditory information, language comprehension, and memory. It's also involved in recognizing faces and objects. And then the occipital lobe at the very back of the brain is all about processing visual information.
It's incredible how each part of the brain has its own unique function. We could talk about the brain all day, but let's move on to a related topic.
Okay.
Sensation and perception. I always get those two mixed up.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Think about sensation as the raw data coming in from the world, and perception is how we actually make sense of that data.
Okay.
So sensation is about detecting physical stimuli, like light, sound waves, and converting those into neural signals that our brains can actually understand.
So it's like our sense organs are translators, kind of converting the language of the world into the language of the brain.
I love that analogy. That's a great way to put it.
Thanks.
And then perception is that next step.
Okay.
It's how our brains interpret and organize those sensory signals, giving them meaning and creating our experience of the world.
So our senses are like the ingredients, and our brains are cooking up the meal.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, our sources mention something called transduction.
Yes.
That happens during sensation.
Right.
What's that all about?
Transduction is the process of converting one form of energy into another. So when we're talking about sensation, it's about transforming that physical energy from the environment, like light or sound waves, into those neural signals that our brains can process.
Wow, that's amazing. So we're, receiving all this information through our senses.
Right.
But it's our brain that's actually making sense of it all.
That's right.
Okay, well, our sources delve into a lot of the different senses.
Yeah.
But let's just focus on vision for now.
Okay.
When you think about visual perception, what comes to mind?
Well, we can see depth and color and shapes and all sorts of things, and it seems so effortless.
It does.
But I know it's incredibly complex.
Yeah, it is. There's so much going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So, for example, we perceive depth and distance.
Right.
Using both binocular and monocular cues.
Exactly. So binocular cues rely on their slightly different images that are received by each eye, which the brain then compares.
It's like how those 3D movies work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One key binocular cue is something called binocular disparity, which is the difference between those images projected onto each retina. And then we have monocular cues, which we can perceive even with only one eye. These include things like linear perspective, where parallel lines appear to converge in the distance.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely noticed it when I'm driving and looking down a long, straight road.
Right.
So we have binocular cues using both eyes, monocular cues using just one. What other tricks does our brain have up its sleeve to make sense of the visual world?
Well, think about object constancy.
Okay.
It's our brain's ability to see objects as stable and unchanging, even when the image on our retina is actually changing.
Okay.
So, for example, size constancy allows us to perceive a car as the same size, whether it's right in front of us, or allows us to perceive a car as the same size, whether it's right in front of us or far away, even though the image on our retina is much smaller when it's distant.
That's fascinating. It's like our brain is constantly adjusting for context to give us this consistent view of the world. Yeah. I imagine this applies to other aspects of vision too, right?
Absolutely. Object constancy works with shape and color as well. We perceive a door as rectangular even when it's open, and the shape on our retina is distorted, and we perceive a flower as the same color even under different lighting conditions.
It's incredible how our brain kind of fills in those gaps and corrects for those inconsistencies to create this seamless visual experience. Now, what about our other senses? Are there any fascinating tidbits about those?
Well, with hearing, it's really important to be mindful of potential damage from loud noises, especially from those headphones we all love to use.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of blasting my music sometimes. What about taste?
Taste is interesting because it's strongly influenced by both biology and culture. For example, some people are super tasters, meaning they have a higher density of taste buds and experience flavors more intensely than others.
I'm definitely not a super taster. I love strong flavors. How does culture come into play?
Well, culture has a big impact on taste preferences. What's considered delicious in one culture might be repulsive in another.
That's so true. I've definitely experienced that while traveling. Okay, let's talk about smell. It seems like such a mysterious sense.
Smell is unique because it actually bypasses the thalamus and goes directly to the olfactory bulb, the brain's smell center. And while we can discriminate among countless odors, we're not very good at naming them.
Oh, I can totally relate to that. I know a smell is familiar, but I can rarely put a name to it.
It's a common experience. Interestingly, women tend to be better at identifying odors than men.
Huh. That is interesting. I wonder why that is. Well, we've taken quite a journey through the world of the senses. Now let's move on to learning, that essential process that lets us adapt and acquire new knowledge.
Learning is constantly happening, both consciously and unconsciously, from infancy to old age. It's how we acquire information and change our behaviors based on our experiences.
I always think about learning in a classroom setting, but it's so much broader than that. our sources talk about different types of learning. Let's start with classical conditioning. Can you remind me about that one?
Classical conditioning is all about associating stimuli and learning to anticipate events. Think about Pavlov and his dogs. He paired the presentation of food, which naturally makes dogs salivate, with the sound of a metronome. After repeated pairings, the dogs started salivating at the sound of the metronome alone, even without the food.
Oh yeah, they learn to associate the sound with the food. That's fascinating. Can you break down the key terms involved in classical conditioning?
Absolutely. The unconditioned stimulus, or UCS, is something that naturally triggers a response without any prior learning. In Pavlov's case, the food was the UCS. The unconditioned response, or UCR, is that natural, unlearned response to the UCS. For Pavlov's dogs, it was salivating in response to the food.
Okay, so the UCS naturally leads to the UCR. No learning involved. Got it. What about the conditioned parts?
The conditioned stimulus, or CS, is a previously neutral stimulus that, after being paired with the UCS, comes to elicit a response. In Pavlov's experiment, the metronome was the CS, and the conditioned response, or CR, is the learned response to that previously neutral stimulus. So the dogs learned to associate the metronome, CS, with the food, UCS, and began to salivate, CR, at the sound of the metronome alone.
So the dog learned a new association, and now the metronome triggers the same response that the food used to. Are there other important concepts we should know about in classical conditioning?
Yes. There's acquisition, the initial stage of learning when that association between the CS and the UCS is being formed. Then there's extinction, the gradual weakening of the CR when the CS is presented without the UCS repeatedly. Imagine if Pavlov kept ringing the metronome without giving the dogs any food. Eventually, their salivation response to the metronome would fade away.
Makes sense. So the association can be unlearned. Are there any other key concepts we should cover?
Definitely. Generalization is the tendency to respond to stimuli similar to the CS. So the dogs might salivate to sounds similar to the metronome. And then there's discrimination, the learned ability to distinguish between the CS and similar stimuli. With enough training, those dogs could learn to only salivate to the specific tone of that metronome and not to other tones.
Wow, so even dogs can learn to be picky. It's fascinating how these simple principles can shape behavior.
It is, and those same principles apply to humans as well.
That makes me wonder, are there any real-world examples of how classical conditioning shapes our behavior?
Absolutely. Think about how certain smells or sounds can trigger strong emotional memories. Maybe the smell of freshly baked cookies reminds you of your grandmother's kitchen, or a particular song takes you back to a specific time in your life. Those are examples of how classical conditioning has shaped your emotional responses to those stimuli.
That's amazing. It makes me want to pay more attention to those seemingly random emotional reactions I have to things. Okay, so we've covered classical conditioning. What about operant conditioning?
Operant conditioning is all about consequences. It focuses on how rewards and punishments influence our behavior.
So good behavior gets rewarded, bad behavior gets punished, and that shapes our actions.
That's the basic idea. It's built on Thorndike's law of effect, which states that behaviors followed by favorable consequences are more likely to be repeated, while those followed by unpleasant consequences are less likely. B.F. Skinner really formalized this with his work on operant conditioning.
Okay, so reinforcement strengthens behavior and punishment weakens it.
Yeah.
And are there different types of reinforcement?
Yes. There's positive reinforcement, which involves presenting a rewarding stimulus after a behavior, making that behavior more likely.
Like giving a dog a treat for sitting on command.
Exactly. And then there's negative reinforcement, which involves removing an aversive stimulus after a behavior.
So it's not about punishment, but about taking away something unpleasant.
Right. Think about taking an aspirin to relieve a headache. The act of taking the aspirin is negatively reinforced because it removes that unpleasant headache.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got positive reinforcement, adding something good, and negative reinforcement, taking away something bad. What about punishment? Does that have different types as well?
It does. Just like with reinforcement, we have positive punishment and negative punishment.
I'm guessing positive punishment means adding something unpleasant, like a scolding or a timeout.
You got it. Positive punishment is presenting something aversive after a behavior to make it less likely to happen again.
And negative punishment is about removing something pleasurable, like taking away a teenager's phone for breaking curfew.
Exactly. It's all about the consequences. Our sources also mention a theory about how strong different reinforcers can be. Can you explain that?
Yeah, what's that about?
David Premack's theory suggests that a reinforcer's power depends on how much someone, when free to do anything, would naturally choose to engage in the behavior associated with that reinforcer.
So it's about individual preferences. What's rewarding for one person might not be for another.
Precisely. For a kid who loves reading, extra reading time might be a highly effective reward. But for a kid who'd rather play video games, that wouldn't be nearly as motivating.
And context matters too, right? A glass of water is a much better reward when you're thirsty than when you've just chugged a whole bottle.
You're right. Reinforcement is a dynamic process. It's also worth mentioning that punishment, while sometimes necessary, can have unintended negative consequences.
Like what?
Well, punishment can lead to fear and anxiety, and it doesn't always teach the desired behavior. It can also damage relationships, which can be particularly harmful when we're talking about parents and children or teachers and students.
That's a really important point to remember. Okay, so we've got classical and operant conditioning, both powerful forces in shaping behavior. What about observational learning?
Observational learning is all about learning by watching others.
Like how kids often imitate their parents' behavior.
Exactly. It's learning through modeling. Albert Bandura's famous Bobo doll experiment demonstrated just how powerful this type of learning can be.
Can you remind us about that experiment?
Bandura had children observe adults interacting with a Bobo doll, which is basically an inflatable clown punching bag. Some kids saw adults acting aggressively towards the doll, hitting and kicking it. Other kids saw adults playing calmly with the doll. Guess what happened when the kids were then given a chance to interact with the Bobo doll?
I'm guessing the kids who saw the aggressive adults were more likely to act aggressively towards the doll themselves.
Exactly. The kids mimicked what they had observed. And this has big implications for things like media violence.
So kids exposed to violence in movies or video games might be more likely to act aggressively themselves.
That's the concern. Studies suggest that exposure to media violence can increase aggression, likely through observational learning and desensitization.
That's definitely something to think about. Okay, let's move on to another fascinating aspect of psychology memory. I'm constantly amazed by how much information our brains can store.
It truly is remarkable. Memory is the ability to encode, store, and retrieve information over time. It's essential for learning, for our sense of self, and for navigating the world around us.
What are the different types of memory?
There are three main types: sensory memory, short-term memory, also known as working memory, and long-term memory.
Let's start with sensory memory. What's that all about?
Sensory memory is incredibly brief. It holds sensory information for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for us to process it and decide if it's worth paying attention to.
So it's like a fleeting impression. If I glance at a picture and quickly look away, that brief visual image I hold is sensory memory.
Exactly. It's incredibly temporary. Now, short-term memory or working memory is where that information goes if we do decide it's important. It's the active processing system that holds a limited amount of information in our conscious awareness.
It's what we use to remember a phone number long enough to dial it, right? But I know I can't hold too many things in mind at once.
That's because short-term memory has a limited capacity. We can typically hold around 7 plus or minus 2 items at a time. It's like our mental juggling act. We can only keep so many balls in the air.
That explains why I can never remember more than a few items on a grocery list without writing it down. What about long-term memory?
Long-term memory is our vast storehouse of knowledge, experiences, and skills. It has a practically limitless capacity and can hold information for decades, even a lifetime.
It's our mental library. Our sources mention that memories aren't stored in one specific location in the brain. Can you elaborate on that?
That's right. Memories aren't localized to a single spot. They're distributed across different brain regions, depending on the type of information being stored. Memories of visual experiences are processed and stored in visual areas of the brain, while memories of sounds are stored in auditory areas.
So it's more like a network of interconnected memories. How does that work?
Imagine each piece of information as a node in a vast network. When you learn something new, your brain creates connections between that new information and existing nodes. For example, when you see a fire engine, your brain activates a network of nodes related to fire engines, the color red, the truck shape, the siren sound.
So it's like a chain reaction of associations. The more associations you have, the easier it is to remember something.
Exactly. It's like having multiple paths leading to the same destination. The more paths you have, the more likely you are to find your way there.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. Now, our sources also distinguish between explicit and implicit memory. What's the difference between those?
Explicit memory, also known as declarative memory, is the conscious memory for facts and events that we can intentionally retrieve and declare. It's what we typically think of when we talk about remembering something.
Like remembering historical facts or what I had for breakfast this morning.
Exactly. Now, implicit memory, also known as non-declarative memory, is unconscious memory that influences our behavior without our conscious awareness.
So it's memory working behind the scenes.
Precisely. A great example of implicit memory is procedural memory, memory for skills and habits.
Like riding a bike or tying my shoes. Those are things I don't have to consciously think about.
Right. And interestingly, another type of implicit memory can influence our attitudes and preferences, making us more likely to like things we've been exposed to before, even if we don't consciously remember that exposure.
So our unconscious mind is more powerful than we realize. It can even shape our likes and dislikes. Now, speaking of unconscious influences, our sources mention the possibility of memory distortion and even false memories. What can you tell us about that?
Unfortunately, our memories aren't perfect. They can be influenced by our emotions, expectations, and even suggestions from others, leading to distortions or completely fabricated memories.
That sounds a bit unsettling. Are there any famous examples of this?
Elizabeth Loftus, a renowned memory researcher, has conducted numerous studies showing how easily false memories can be implanted.
It's like the movie Inception, but for memories.
In a way, yes. In one study, Loftus and her colleagues asked participants to recall childhood events that had been reported by their parents. One of the events, getting lost in a shopping mall, was actually fabricated by the researchers. But a surprising number of participants remembered the false event, even providing vivid details.
Wow. It really shows how suggestible our memories can be.
It's a powerful demonstration, and this research has important implications for eyewitness testimony and the legal system. It highlights the potential for false accusations and wrongful convictions based on faulty memories.
It's scary to think about how easily our memories can be manipulated. Okay, let's shift gears to a different set of mental processes.
Yeah.
Thinking, language, and intelligence.
Thinking encompasses a wide range of mental activities, including problem-solving, decision-making, reasoning, and creativity. It's what allows us to make sense of the world and interact with it effectively.
It's what makes us human. Let's start with problem solving. How do we approach and solve problems?
One common strategy is to break down complex problems into smaller, more manageable sub-goals.
So instead of getting overwhelmed by the big picture, we tackle it one step at a time.
Exactly. We also use algorithms and heuristics.
Can you remind us what those are?
An algorithm is a step-by-step procedure that guarantees a solution if you follow it correctly. Think of a math formula or a recipe.
So a foolproof method, but not always applicable to every problem. What about heuristics?
Heuristics are mental shortcuts or rules of thumb that let us make quick decisions and solve problems efficiently. But they can sometimes lead to biases and errors.
It's like sacrificing accuracy for speed. What about decision-making? Are there different approaches to that?
You bet. Some people are maximizers, always striving for the absolute best choice. Others are satisficers, aiming for a good enough option that meets their minimum needs.
I definitely lean towards satisficing. I don't have the time or energy to weigh every single option.
You're not alone. And research suggests that while maximizers might get objectively better results, they're often less happy with their decisions.
That makes sense. They're probably always second-guessing themselves and wondering if they could have done better. Now, let's talk about intelligence. What is it exactly?
Intelligence is a complex idea. It includes the ability to learn from experience, to reason abstractly, to solve problems, and to adapt to new situations.
Our sources mentioned general intelligence, or GG. What's that all about?
G was proposed by Charles Spearman. He argued that there's a single underlying factor that influences our performance across various cognitive tasks.
So like a mental horsepower that drives all of our thinking abilities.
That's a good analogy. And it's often measured using IQ tests.
Speaking of IQ tests, how do they work?
There's standardized tests designed to measure cognitive abilities and intellectual potential. They usually look at things like verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed.
I know IQ tests have been pretty controversial over the years. What are some of the criticisms?
One major criticism is that IQ tests don't capture the full range of human intelligence. They often focus on academic skills while neglecting things like creativity, emotional intelligence, and practical skills.
It reminds me of that saying, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid.
Exactly. Each person has their own unique strengths. Another criticism is that IQ tests can be culturally biased, favoring people from certain backgrounds or with certain experiences.
So IQ scores might be influenced by cultural knowledge and opportunities as much as innate intelligence.
That's a possibility, and it's important to interpret IQ scores carefully and recognize their limitations.
What about the whole nature versus nurture debate when it comes to intelligence? Have researchers figured out how much is due to genes and how much is due to environment?
It's complicated, but studies suggest that both genes and environment are important. Twin studies have shown that identical twins raised apart have more similar IQs than fraternal twins raised together, which suggests a strong genetic component.
But environment must play a role too, right?
Absolutely. Think about adoption studies. Children raised in stimulating environments often have higher IQs than those raised in less stimulating environments, even if their biological parents had lower IQs.
So environment can either boost or hold back genetic potential.
Exactly. And then there's the Flynn effect, which is the observation that average IQ scores have been steadily rising across generations.
So humanity's getting smarter over time. That's kind of encouraging.
It is. While the reasons are still debated, it could be due to better nutrition, healthcare, and education, or even increased exposure to more complex environments through technology.
Wow. So many factors at play. Okay, let's move on to human development, that fascinating journey from infancy to old age.
Human development is a lifelong process of change, physically, cognitively, socially, and emotionally. It's shaped by our genes, our environment, and the choices we make.
Our sources begin with attachment. What can you tell us about that?
Attachment is the deep emotional bond between an infant and their primary caregivers. It provides a sense of security and comfort and sets the stage for healthy social and emotional development.
I've heard of Harlow's monkey experiment. Wasn't that about attachment?
Yes. Harry Harlow's research with rhesus monkeys in the 1950s was groundbreaking. He challenged the prevailing belief that attachment was solely about food and nourishment.
Can you describe the experiment?
He separated infant monkeys from their mothers and raised them with surrogate mothers. One was made of wire mesh but had a bottle for feeding. The other was covered in soft terry cloth but offered no food. What Harlow observed was that the monkey spent far more time clinging to the cloth mother, even though it didn't provide any food.
So comfort and contact were more important than food.
Exactly. Harlow's research highlighted the importance of contact comfort, that physical and emotional closeness in infant needs to feel secure.
It really underscores the power of love and nurturing. Harlow's work must have had a huge impact on our understanding of child development.
It did. It showed that those early bonding experiences are critical. Now, our sources also talk about cognitive development, how our thinking abilities change over time. I remember learning about Piaget's stages of cognitive development.
Oh yeah, I remember the names of the stages, but I could definitely use a reminder about what each one entails. Let's start with the sensorimotor stage.
The sensorimotor stage lasts from birth to about age 2. It's all about exploring the world through senses and actions. Infants learn by touching, tasting, looking, and listening. One of the key developments during this stage is object permanence.
Object permanent, that's the understanding that things continue to exist even when we can't see them, right?
Exactly. Before infants develop object permanence, they'll often stop looking for a toy that's been hidden, as if it has completely vanished.
That's adorable. It's amazing to think about how much learning is happening in those first 2 years of life. What about the next stage, the pre-operational stage?
The pre-operational stage spans from about ages 2 to 7. During this time, language and symbolic thinking blossom. Children start to use words and images to represent objects and ideas, but their thinking is still quite egocentric.
Egocentric meaning they have trouble seeing things from another person's point of view?
Exactly. They tend to assume that everyone sees and experiences the world the same way they do.
And they have incredibly vivid imaginations.
Yes. Pretend play really takes off during this stage. Children can use objects to represent other things and create imaginative scenarios.
What about the concrete operational stage? What happens during those years?
The concrete operational stage from about ages 7 to 11 is marked by the development of more logical thinking. Children become capable of performing mental operations, but those operations are still limited to concrete objects and situations.
So they can start to understand things like conservation, where the amount of liquid doesn't change just because it's poured into a differently shaped container.
Exactly. They also understand reversibility, that actions can be undone. For example, they grasp that if you add 2 plus 3, you can then subtract 3 to get back to 2.
Okay, and finally, the formal operational stage.
This final stage begins around age 12 and continues throughout adulthood. This is when abstract and hypothetical thinking emerge. Adolescents can reason about abstract concepts like justice and morality and engage in more complex problem solving.
They can actually start to ponder the big questions about life.
Precisely. They can also think more scientifically, forming hypotheses and testing them systematically.
Piaget's theory is so interesting, but are there any criticisms of it?
There are. Some argue that Piaget underestimated children's abilities at different stages. They believe that cognitive development is more continuous and less stage-like than he proposed. Others point out that cultural and environmental factors can play a big role in how quickly and in what ways children develop these skills.
It makes sense that there would be individual differences and cultural variations. Okay, what about psychosocial development? How do our social and emotional selves develop?
Erik Erikson, a developmental psychologist, proposed a theory of psychosocial development that spans the entire lifespan.
I've heard about his 8 stages. Could you give us a brief overview?
Sure. Each stage involves a specific psychosocial crisis or challenge. The first stage, trust versus mistrust, happens during infancy. It's all about developing a sense of trust in caregivers.
It makes sense that if that basic trust isn't established early on, it could have lasting effects on relationships later in life.
Exactly. The second stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt, occurs during toddlerhood. This is when children start asserting their independence and trying to do things for themselves.
The terrible twos.
Right. Then we have initiative versus guilt, which happens during the preschool years. Children are exploring their world, taking initiative, and developing a sense of purpose. The fourth stage, industry versus inferiority, takes place during elementary school. This is when children are focused on developing competence and mastering new skills, both academic and social.
That's when social comparisons become more important, right?
Yes. Kids start comparing themselves to their peers and figuring out where they fit in. The fifth stage, identity versus role confusion, takes center stage during adolescence. Teens are exploring their identities, figuring out their values, and trying to answer the question, who am I?
It's a big question, and it can take a while to figure out the answer.
Absolutely. The sixth stage, intimacy versus isolation, happens during young adulthood and focuses on forming close and meaningful relationships. The seventh stage, generativity versus stagnation, hits during middle adulthood. It's about contributing to society and leaving a lasting impact on the world. And finally, the eighth stage, ego integrity versus despair, occurs during late adulthood. It's a time of reflection on one's life, finding a sense of meaning and acceptance.
It sounds like a lifelong journey of growth and change.
It truly is. While Erikson's theory has been incredibly influential, it's important to remember that these stages aren't set in stone. The timing and how we resolve these psychosocial crises can vary depending on individual experiences and cultural influences.
That makes sense. Yeah. Everyone's journey is unique. Now let's delve into the world of motivation and emotion. What drives our behavior, and how do we experience and express our feelings?
Motivation is the force behind our actions, the energy and direction that propels us towards a goal. It can stem from basic biological needs like hunger and thirst, or from more complex psychological needs like achievement and belonging.
In emotion, what role does that play?
Emotion is a complex psychological state with 3 main components: a subjective experience, a physiological response, and a behavioral or expressive response.
So it's more than just a feeling, right? It's a whole body experience.
Exactly. For example, if you're feeling afraid, you'll experience a subjective feeling of fear accompanied by physical changes like a racing heart and sweaty palms. You might also have behavioral responses like freezing or fleeing.
It's like our minds and bodies are working together to respond to the situation. Our sources mention the role of the amygdala in emotions, particularly fear. Can you talk more about that?
The amygdala, a little almond-shaped structure in the brain, is like our emotional processing center. Especially for fear and aggression, it's always on the lookout for potential threats, allowing us to respond quickly even before we're consciously aware of the danger.
So the amygdala is our built-in alarm system. But I imagine it does more than just process fear, right?
You're right. While it plays a key role in fear responses, it's also involved in processing other emotions, including those related to pleasure and reward.
That makes sense. Our sources also distinguish between drives and incentives when it comes to motivation. Can you explain those concepts?
Think of drives as internal states of tension that arise from unmet biological needs. These drives push us to behave in ways that will reduce that tension and restore balance.
So like hunger driving us to eat or thirst driving us to drink.
Precisely. Now, incentives are external stimuli or rewards that pull us towards certain behaviors. They can be positive, like getting a bonus at work, or negative, like avoiding getting a speeding ticket.
So drives push us from within. And incentives pull us from the outside world. And what about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation? What's the difference?
Intrinsic motivation is all about doing something for the pure enjoyment of it. It comes from within, like playing a sport for the love of the game or pursuing a hobby because it's fulfilling. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, comes from external factors like doing something to earn a reward or avoid punishment.
You nailed it. And here's where it gets really interesting. Research suggests that external rewards can actually undermine intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, it's true.
Really? How does that work?
Well, if you're rewarded for something you already enjoy doing, your focus can shift from the inherent pleasure of the activity to the external reward. And this can actually diminish your intrinsic motivation over time.
It's like if you love to paint and then start selling your paintings, the focus might shift from the joy of creating to the financial gain, potentially making the act of painting feel less enjoyable over time.
Exactly. Now, let's shift our focus to the interplay of psychology and health.
Stress definitely comes to mind. It seems like a major factor in so many health problems.
You're right. Stress is a constant in modern life, and it can significantly impact both our physical and mental health. Stress is basically our response to challenging or demanding situations that typically involve unpleasant states, like anxiety or tension.
So what kinds of things trigger this stress response?
Stressors are events or stimuli that we perceive as threatening or demanding, and they can be acute, like a traffic jam or a sudden deadline, or chronic, like job strain or relationship issues.
So stressors are like those things that push our buttons, and our response to them is how we cope.
Precisely. Our coping responses are attempts to avoid, escape from, or minimize the stressor, and there are many ways to cope, some more effective than others.
Our sources talk about the body's physiological response to stress. Can you walk us through that?
When we face a stressor, our bodies activate the fight or flight response, a cascade of physiological changes that prepare us to either confront the threat or run away from it.
It's like our bodies are getting ready for battle. What happens during this response?
It involves the sympathetic nervous system kicking into gear and the release of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. These hormones increase our heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing, giving us that surge of energy. They also suppress non-essential functions like digestion and immune response to conserve resources.
So, in the short term, stress can actually be helpful. It can give us that boost we need to deal with the challenge.
Exactly. The fight or flight response is designed for dealing with acute threats. But when stress becomes chronic, these physiological changes can take a toll on our health.
That's what I've always heard. Chronic stress weakens the immune system.
That's right. The prolonged exposure to those stress hormones suppresses the production of lymphocytes, our infection-fighting white blood cells, making us more vulnerable to getting sick.
It's incredible how our mental state can directly affect our physical health. Stress literally makes us sick. Our sources mention a theory about the stages of physiological coping with stress. Can you explain that?
Hans Selye, a pioneer in stress research, came up with the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS. It's a model that describes our body's response to prolonged stress.
What are the different stages?
The first stage is alarm, that initial shock reaction to the stressor when that fight or flight response kicks in. The second stage is resistance, where the body adapts to the stressor's presence, but at a cost. The body stays on high alert, but its resources are being depleted. And finally, if the stress continues or those resources become exhausted, we enter the third stage, exhaustion.
Exhaustion sounds pretty scary.
It can be. In this stage, our defenses break down, making us more susceptible to illness, burnout, and even serious health problems like heart disease.
It's like pushing your body to the limit for too long. That's why it's so important to find healthy ways to manage stress. What are some effective coping mechanisms?
Our sources talk about two main types: problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping.
So problem-focused coping is about tackling the issue head-on.
Right. It involves taking direct action to address the stressor, either eliminating or reducing its impact.
And emotion-focused coping is more about managing our feelings about the stressful situation.
Exactly. It focuses on regulating our emotional response rather than directly confronting the problem.
Okay, so problem-focused is about fixing the problem, and emotion-focused is about managing our reactions. Are both equally helpful?
Well, both can be beneficial depending on the situation. If it's a controllable stressor, problem-focused coping is often the best approach. But if it's an uncontrollable situation, emotion-focused coping can be more effective. Sometimes you just have to ride out the storm and focus on taking care of your emotional well-being.
That makes sense. Now, let's move on to a fascinating and often perplexing area of psychology: social psychology?
Social psychology explores how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the presence of others, both real and imagined. It's about how we interact, form impressions, and behave in groups.
It's the psychology of being human in a social world. Our sources start with group behavior. What are some of the key concepts there?
One fundamental concept is the distinction between in-groups and out-groups. An in-group is a social group to which a person psychologically identifies as being a member. An out-group is a social group with which an individual does not identify.
It's the classic us versus them mentality.
You could say that. And what's fascinating is that we have a natural tendency to show favoritism towards. And what's fascinating is that we have a natural tendency to show favoritism towards our in-groups, even when the groups are formed arbitrarily.
Wait, really? Even if there's no real basis for the distinction?
Exactly. A classic study by Henri Tajfel demonstrated this. He divided participants into groups based on meaningless criteria, like their preference for one painter over another. Even with this random grouping, participants still showed in-group favoritism, allocating more resources to their own group.
Wow. So it's like we're hardwired for tribalism.
It seems so. This in-group favoritism might have evolved as an adaptive strategy, promoting cooperation and survival within groups. But of course, it can also lead to prejudice and discrimination against those we perceive as belonging to the out-group.
That's the dark side of tribalism. Our sources also talk about conformity and obedience. Those are powerful forces.
They are. Conformity is the tendency to adjust our behavior to match group norms or expectations.
Like following the crowd, even if we don't agree with what they're doing.
Exactly. Think about Solomon Asch's classic study on conformity. He showed participants a series of lines and asked them to match a target line to one of 3 comparison lines.
That sounds pretty straightforward.
It was. When alone, participants had no trouble picking the correct line. But when they were in a group with Confederates, people pretending to be participants but actually working for the experimenter who intentionally gave the wrong answer, the real participants often conformed to the group's incorrect judgment.
So even when we know something is wrong, the pressure to conform can be stronger than our own perception of reality.
It's a powerful force. And then there's obedience to authority, which is even more disturbing.
You're talking about Milgram's famous shock experiment.
Yes. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram's experiments showed just how far ordinary people will go to obey authority figures, even when it involves harming others.
Can you remind us what happened in those experiments?
Participants thought they were delivering electric shocks to another person, who was actually an actor pretending to be in pain, as part of a learning experiment. The shocks increased in intensity with each wrong answer.
That sounds intense.
It was. And the experimenter, an authority figure wearing a lab coat, urged the participants to keep delivering the shocks, even as the learner begged them to stop.
Did people actually go through with it? Did they deliver the highest level of shock?
Disturbingly, many did. Over 60% in some variations of the experiment went all the way to the highest shock level, even though they were clearly uncomfortable and distressed.
That's terrifying. It suggests that our brains are wired to obey authority, even when it goes against our morals.
It does. Milgram's experiment raised serious ethical questions about the power of social influence and the potential for abuse of authority.
It also highlights how important it is to think critically and have the courage to challenge unethical orders.
Exactly. Now, moving on to attitudes, which are our evaluations of people, objects, and ideas.
So it's basically how we feel about things, whether we like them or dislike them, agree with them or disagree.
Precisely. And these attitudes shape our beliefs, feelings, and behaviors.
Are all of our attitudes the same?
Attitudes can be explicit, meaning we're consciously aware of them and can readily express them, or they can be implicit, operating unconsciously and automatically, sometimes even contradicting our conscious beliefs.
Wow. So we might not even be aware of some of our own attitudes.
That's right. Implicit attitudes can be revealed through subtle behaviors and reactions, even when we think we hold different views.
That's pretty fascinating. What about the concept of cognitive dissonance? Can you explain that one?
Cognitive dissonance is the uncomfortable feeling we get when we hold 2 conflicting beliefs, or when our actions don't line up with our beliefs.
Like a mental clash.
Exactly. And to reduce that tension, we're often motivated to either change our beliefs or our behavior to align them.
So if I believe that eating healthy is important, but I constantly indulge in junk food, I might either convince myself that junk food isn't that bad, or I might finally start eating healthier.
Precisely. Leon Festinger did a classic study on cognitive dissonance. He had participants do a boring task and then offered them either $1 or $20 to lie and tell someone else that the task was fun. What he found was that the people who were paid only $1 were more likely to change their attitudes about the task and report that they actually enjoyed it.
Wait, that doesn't seem logical. Shouldn't the people paid more be more likely to lie?
It does seem counterintuitive, but Festinger explained it this way. The people paid $20 had a good reason for lying. They were well compensated. But the people paid only $1 had very little justification for lying, creating that uncomfortable cognitive dissonance. To reduce that dissonance, they changed their attitude about the task.
So our minds can find creative ways to justify our actions, even if those actions go against our beliefs. That's both fascinating and a little bit alarming.
It is. Cognitive dissonance is a powerful force.
We've covered so much ground in the social world. Let's move on to another fascinating aspect of psychology: personality. What makes each of us unique and shapes how we interact with the world?
Personality is all about those enduring patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that make us who we are. It's our individual style of being in the world.
It's that unique fingerprint that sets us apart. What are some of the main approaches to understanding personality?
One very influential approach is the trait approach. It focuses on identifying stable personality traits that differ from person to person.
Traits are like those adjectives we use to describe people, right?
Right.
Outgoing, shy, friendly, organized.
Exactly. And one of the most widely accepted models of personality traits is the Big Five, also known as the five-factor model. Think ocean.
Ocean. I like it. It's easy to remember. But what does it stand for?
The Big Five traits are openness to experience, imaginative, curious, open to new ideas, conscientiousness, organized, responsible, dependable, extroversion, outgoing, sociable, assertive, agreeableness, cooperative, compassionate, trusting, and neuroticism, prone to negative emotions like anxiety and worry.
So the Big Five covers a wide spectrum of personality dimensions. What makes this model so important?
Research has shown that these traits are relatively stable over time and across situations. Plus, they can predict all sorts of things about our lives: how well we do at work, the quality of our relationships, even our health and well-being.
That's impressive. Now, what about other approaches? I vaguely remember learning about Freud's psychodynamic theory.
Sigmund Freud's work was groundbreaking, though it's also been heavily debated. He believed that our personalities are shaped by unconscious conflicts and motivations, often rooted in our early childhood experiences.
It's like those hidden forces within us driving our behavior.
Precisely. Freud divided the personality into three structures: the id, the ego, and the superego.
Can you break those down for us? They sound a bit intimidating.
Think of the id as the impulsive child within us. It's the primitive, instinctual part of our personality that operates on the pleasure principle. It wants immediate gratification. The ego is the more rational, problem-solving part of our personality that operates on the reality principle. It tries to satisfy the id's urges in a way that's realistic and acceptable.
So the ego is like the negotiator between our impulsive desires and the constraints of the real world. What about the superego?
The superego is like our internalized moral compass. It represents our conscience and tells us what's right and wrong.
So we have the demanding id, the mediating ego, and the moral superego. What happens when they clash?
According to Freud, these conflicts, often stemming from unresolved issues from childhood, can lead to anxiety, defense mechanisms, and even psychological disorders.
It sounds like a constant mental battle. I know Freud's theory has been influential, but I've also heard it has its critics.
Oh, definitely. Many of Freud's concepts, like the Oedipus complex, are considered outdated and lack empirical support. His focus on unconscious drives in early childhood has been challenged by perspectives that emphasize conscious thoughts and social influences.
That makes sense. Our understanding of the mind has evolved so much since Freud's time.
It has. Now, our sources also mention the humanistic approach to personality.
Yes. That's the one that seems more optimistic and focuses on our potential for growth.
You got it. Humanistic psychologists like Carl Rogers believe that people are inherently good and are driven to self-actualize to become the best versions of themselves.
It's a refreshing perspective.
Rogers emphasized the importance of our self-concept, which is our beliefs and perceptions about ourselves, and the impact of conditions of worth.
What are conditions of worth?
These are the messages we get from others about what we need to be or do to be loved and accepted.
I see. So if a child is constantly told they need to be good at math to be worthy of love, they might internalize that message and develop a conditional sense of self-worth.
Exactly. They start to believe they're only lovable if they excel in certain areas, which, as you can imagine, can be pretty damaging. Rogers believed these conditions of worth can lead to incongruence, a mismatch between our true selves and the selves we present to the world.
It's like we're forced to wear a mask to please others.
Exactly, and this incongruence can fuel anxiety, depression, and other issues.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, our sources also touch on the social cognitive approach to personality.
The social cognitive approach, championed by Albert Bandura, highlights the role of social learning and our thought processes in shaping our personalities.
So it's about how we learn by observing others and how our thoughts influence our actions.
Right. Bandura emphasized the idea of reciprocal determinism, the concept that our personalities are shaped by a constant interplay between our behavior, our thoughts, and our environment.
So it's a dynamic system, not just one factor dictating the others.
Precisely. Our personalities aren't set in stone, but are constantly evolving through our interactions with the world.
It's empowering to think we have the power to shape our own personalities. Okay, let's shift gears to a topic that can be challenging but important to understand: psychological disorders.
Psychological disorders are patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are dysfunctional, distressing, and often interfere with daily life. They cause significant disruption and suffering.
It's crucial to remember that these are real medical conditions, just like physical illnesses.
Absolutely. And just like physical illnesses, they can be treated. Our sources mention the DSM-5. Can you remind me what that is?
The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. It's basically the handbook mental health professionals use to diagnose and classify psychological disorders.
It's an important tool for creating a common language and understanding of these disorders, but it has received some criticism.
What are some of the concerns people have raised about the DSM?
One critique is that it relies on a categorical approach, meaning you either have a disorder or you don't. This may not accurately reflect the complexity and fluidity of mental health. Some advocate for a dimensional approach, viewing mental disorders as existing on a spectrum rather than being distinct categories.
So it's not always a clear-cut yes or no when diagnosing these conditions.
Exactly. Another criticism is that the DSM might focus too much on symptoms and not enough on the underlying causes.
Our sources mention the diathesis stress model. What is that?
The diathesis stress model proposes that psychological disorders arise from a combination of a predisposition or diathesis and stressful life events.
So it's not just nature or nurture, but an interplay of both.
Precisely. You might have a genetic predisposition to anxiety, but whether you develop an anxiety disorder could depend on the level of stress you experience.
That makes sense. Okay, let's discuss some of the main categories of psychological disorders. What are some common anxiety disorders?
Anxiety disorders are characterized by excessive fear and anxiety that's disproportionate to the actual threat.
But anxiety is a normal human emotion. How do you know when it crosses the line into a disorder?
It becomes a disorder when it's so intense or persistent that it interferes with your daily life.
So what are some specific examples of anxiety disorders?
Generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, involves chronic, excessive worry about various things, often without a specific cause. It's a constant state of unease. Then there's panic disorder, which involves recurrent panic attacks, those sudden episodes of intense fear that come with physical symptoms like a racing heart and difficulty breathing.
Panic attacks sound terrifying. And what about phobias?
Phobias are intense, irrational fears of specific objects or situations.
Like a fear of spiders, heights, or enclosed spaces?
Those are common ones, yes.
Okay, what about mood disorders? What characterizes those?
Mood disorders involve disturbances in mood that are severe, persistent, and impact daily functioning.
Depression is probably the most well-known mood disorder.
That's right. Major depressive disorder, or MDD, is characterized by persistent sadness, hopelessness, and a loss of interest in things that were once enjoyable.
It's more than just feeling sad, though. It's a deeply debilitating condition.
Absolutely. Other symptoms can include changes in sleep and appetite, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and even thoughts of death or suicide.
It's crucial to reach out for help if you're experiencing those symptoms. What about bipolar disorder?
Bipolar disorder involves extreme swings in mood, from manic episodes of high energy and impulsivity to depressive episodes. It's like riding an emotional roller coaster.
That sounds incredibly challenging to manage.
It is. During manic episodes, individuals might take risks, have racing thoughts, and need less sleep. Then they cycle into depressive episodes with the same symptoms as MDD. Bipolar disorder often requires lifelong treatment.
What about schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia is a serious mental illness that makes it hard for a person to think clearly, manage emotions, make decisions, and relate to others. They may appear to be out of touch with reality.
That's right. Schizophrenia is a complex disorder with various symptoms, categorized as positive, negative, and cognitive.
Yes.
What are positive symptoms?
Positive symptoms are additions to a person's experience. These include hallucinations, which are false perceptions like hearing voices or seeing things that aren't there, and delusions, which are firmly held false beliefs.
So they're experiencing things that others don't. What about negative symptoms?
Negative symptoms are things that are diminished or absent. These include lack of motivation, social withdrawal, flat affect or reduced emotional expression, and difficulty with speech and thought processes.
It's not just about added experiences, but also about things being taken away. And what are cognitive symptoms?
Cognitive symptoms involve problems with attention, memory, and executive functioning, like planning and organizing. It's a very challenging disorder.
It sounds like it. Are there treatments that can help?
While there isn't a cure for schizophrenia, treatments are available to manage symptoms and improve quality of life.
Our sources also mention personality disorders. What are those?
Personality disorders are enduring patterns of inflexible thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that differ significantly from cultural expectations, causing distress or impairment in various areas of life.
So it's not just about having a quirky personality, but about patterns that create problems in a person's life.
Exactly. Two examples are borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder.
What are those like?
Borderline personality disorder involves instability in relationships, identity, and emotions. Those with BPD often have intense fears of abandonment, engage in impulsive behaviors, and struggle to regulate their emotions.
That sounds incredibly painful.
It can be. On the other hand, antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a disregard for others' rights, lack of empathy, and a tendency to be deceitful and manipulative. Individuals with ASPD often violate social norms and may engage in criminal behavior.
That sounds very serious. Okay, we've talked about a lot of difficult stuff. Let's end on a more hopeful note. What are some of the main approaches to treating psychological disorders?
There are two main categories: psychotherapy and biological treatments.
Psychotherapy is essentially talk therapy, right? Yeah.
That's right. It involves working with a therapist to address psychological issues, learn coping skills, and improve mental well-being.
What are some of the different types of psychotherapy?
One classic approach is psychodynamic therapy, which draws on Freud's theories and focuses on exploring those unconscious conflicts and motivations we talked about earlier.
So it's about understanding how the past shapes the present.
Exactly. Humanistic therapy emphasizes the client's self-awareness and capacity for growth and healing.
It's about empowering the individual to take control of their mental health. What other approaches are there?
Behavioral therapy focuses on changing maladaptive behaviors. One technique is exposure therapy, where you're gradually exposed to the thing you fear, which can be very effective for treating phobias and anxieties. Then there's cognitive therapy, which focuses on challenging those negative thought patterns that contribute to emotional distress.
It's about reframing our thinking and changing those unhelpful thoughts.
Right. And then, of course, there's cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which blends elements of both cognitive A and D behavioral therapies.
I've heard that CBT is one of the most effective approaches for treating a variety of disorders.
It is. It's very practical and action-oriented, helping people develop coping skills and change those unhealthy thoughts and behaviors.
What about biological treatments? What are some examples of those?
Biological treatments often used alongside psychotherapy involve medications or other medical interventions.
So things like antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and antipsychotics.
Exactly. Antidepressants, like SSRIs, increase serotonin levels in the brain, which can alleviate depression symptoms. Anti-anxiety medications, like benzodiazepines, enhance GABA's effects, reducing anxiety. Antipsychotics work by blocking dopamine receptors, helping manage hallucinations and delusions associated with schizophrenia.
It's incredible how these medications can target specific brain chemicals to help people feel better. What about other biological treatments besides medication?
Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, is sometimes used for severe depression that hasn't responded to other treatments. It involves inducing a brief seizure.
That sounds intense.
It is, and while ECT has a complicated history, it can be a safe and effective treatment when administered correctly. Another newer treatment is transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, which uses magnetic pulses to stimulate specific brain regions. It has shown promise for treating depression as well.
It's amazing how many different approaches are available to help people struggling with mental health.
It is, and we're continually learning and discovering new approaches.
Well, we've certainly covered a vast landscape of knowledge in this deep dive into psychology. We've explored everything from the history of this fascinating field to its research methods, from the intricate workings of the brain to the complexities of human development and social interactions, and from the challenges of psychological disorders to the hope of effective treatments. It's been an amazing journey.
It has, and it really showcases the remarkable complexity and wonder of the human mind.
It makes you appreciate how much we've learned, but also how much there is still to discover.
Absolutely. For example, given how deeply culture influences our behavior, how might the growing interconnectedness of our world through technology change our understanding of psychology in the future?
That's a great question. As technology shapes our lives and connects us across cultures, it will undoubtedly have profound effects on our psychology, both individually and collectively.
It's a very exciting time to be studying the human mind.
It is. We encourage you to keep exploring, asking questions, and learning about the incredible world of psychology.
After all, understanding ourselves and each other is one of the most important and rewarding endeavors we can undertake.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.